Welcome to LSAT Note to Note. In this video, we're going to take a closer look at the different types of logical reasoning questions you'll face on the LSAT. Logical reasoning is one of the most critical sections on the test, as it evaluates your ability to analyze and evaluate arguments. Mastering these question types will give you a huge advantage, so let's dive right in. The first type is must-be-true/most strongly supported questions. In these, you're asked to identify a conclusion that logically follows from the information provided in the stimulus. These questions require you to carefully analyze the facts and pick the answer choice most strongly supported by the evidence. Next, we have strengthen questions. These ask you to find an answer choice that makes the argument stronger by adding support to the relationship between the premises and the conclusion. Your goal is to fortify the argument by reinforcing the reasoning. On the flip side, weaken questions require you to identify an answer that weakens the argument. Here, you're looking for an answer that undermines the link between the premises and the conclusion, casting doubt on the argument's validity. There are two types of assumption questions. Necessary assumption questions ask you to find an assumption that must be true for the argument to hold. Sufficient assumption questions ask you to find an assumption that, if true, guarantees the argument's conclusion is valid. Flaw in reasoning questions ask you to identify an error in the argument's logic. These questions typically focus on common logical fallacies, where the argument goes wrong in the reasoning process that connects the premises to the conclusion. Inference questions ask you to determine what logically follows from the given information. Even if it's not explicitly stated, you need to find the answer choice that can be inferred or is strongly supported by the facts in the stimulus. Principle questions come in two varieties. Principle strengthen questions ask you to apply a principle to support an argument. Principle application questions require you to apply a general principle to a specific case presented in the stimulus. In resolve the paradox questions, you're presented with conflicting information or a paradox. Your task is to choose the answer that resolves the apparent contradiction and makes sense of the conflicting details. Method of reasoning questions ask you to describe how the argument is structured. You'll need to break down the reasoning behind the argument and explain how the premises support the conclusion or how the argument is built. Parallel reasoning and parallel flaw questions ask you to find an argument that is structurally similar to the one presented in the stimulus. In parallel reasoning, you look for a logically identical argument. In parallel flaw, you look for an argument with the same logical flaw. Point at issue and point of agreement questions involve a dialogue between two speakers. Point at issue questions ask you to identify what the speakers disagree about. Point of agreement questions ask you to find where the speakers share common ground. Evaluate the argument questions ask you to determine which piece of information would be most helpful in assessing the argument. Essentially, you're figuring out what question would help determine whether the argument holds up. Finally, role of a statement questions ask you to identify the role that a particular statement plays in the argument. Is it a premise, a conclusion, or perhaps a counterexample? Your job is to figure out how that statement fits into the structure of the argument. That wraps up our overview of the LSAT Logical Reasoning question types. In future videos, we'll break each of these down in more detail to help you develop a strategy for tackling them. Be sure to subscribe for more LSAT tips and strategies, and we'll see you in the next video.